She walked in wearing a hoodie. 3 minutes later, they humiliated her in front of everyone. What the staff didn't know? That nobody was Jasmine Crockett, one of the most powerful civil rights attorneys in the country. The entire restaurant was about to become the stage for a lesson they'd never forget. Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Though this story is fictional, it stands as a tribute to the powerful ideals Jasmine Crockett represents: courage, quiet resistance, and unwavering respect for all. A rainy evening settled over downtown Dallas, the kind that soaked through coats and blurred city lights into streaks of golden gray. Jasmine Crockett stepped out of her car without an umbrella, walking steadily toward L'Atelier, the most elite restaurant in the city. She wore a dark, rain-dampened hoodie, simple black slacks, and flat shoes that splashed lightly on the wet pavement. Her hair was pulled into a no-nonsense bun, and her face was bare. No foundation, no gloss, just the raw, unfiltered look of someone who had spent hours in a courtroom, not a dressing room. The door hadn't even closed behind her when a pair of sharp eyes locked on her from across the room. Linda, the senior server, already deciding she didn't belong. Linda didn't hesitate. The moment her eyes landed on Jasmine, her entire posture shifted, chin tilted slightly, arms folding just tight enough to signal control. She didn't see a high-profile attorney or a woman who had just spent 10 hours defending someone's life in court. What she saw was a soaked hoodie, scuffed shoes, and a face that didn't match the curated aesthetic of L'Atelier. Her gaze swept over Jasmine like a barcode scanner, and what it read was, not wealthy enough, not white enough, not right enough. She stepped forward with mechanical confidence, sliding herself in front of the hostess like a gatekeeper reclaiming her post. The smile on her face was artificial, more performance than politeness. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said crisply, "but unfortunately, we're fully booked for the evening." Jasmine looked past her, calmly, noting the empty tables that dotted the candlelit floor, some already reset, others clearly untouched. "That's strange," she said, voice even. "I see several tables open." Linda didn't even turn to look. "Those are reserved," she snapped, her words too fast, too defensive. "We have large parties arriving any moment now." It was a lie, and not even a good one. Linda's lie hovered in the air, but Jasmine didn't bite. No raised voice, no sarcastic smile, just a calm, steady tone that somehow felt louder than the soft jazz trickling through the restaurant. "I'm not here to make trouble," she said. "I'm not asking for special treatment. I'd just like a table. Any table." Her voice didn't tremble, but it carried something heavier than frustration. Exhaustion, the kind only earned after arguing for someone else's freedom in court all day, only to come here and fight for a seat. Linda stared at her for a beat too long. There was a flicker of irritation. Not because she was busy, but because Jasmine wasn't doing what people like Jasmine were supposed to do: back down quietly and leave. She clicked her tongue lightly, glanced over her shoulder at the room, not to check for space, but to perform the illusion of effort. Then nodded, curt and joyless. "Fine," she said, like the word itself cost her. "Follow me." She turned on her heel without another word, walking fast, sharp steps echoing through the marble floor. Jasmine followed in silence. They passed by half-empty booths glowing under golden light, tables set with polished silver and tall wine glasses filled with red, so smooth it looked like velvet. Waiters smiled at other guests, leaning in to explain pairings, topping off water with graceful flicks of the wrist. But none of those tables were for her. Linda didn't even glance at them. Instead, she veered left, out of the soft light and into a narrower hallway, dim and too quiet, where the air no longer smelled like seared lamb and truffle oil, but like ammonia and old tiles. Jasmine didn't say a word. She already knew where this was going. They stopped at a two-top table tucked against the wall, wedged between the restrooms and the kitchen's swinging door. The door opened and shut every 10 seconds, releasing bursts of heat, steam, and the clang of pots. The table was unlit, uninviting, and clearly a place meant to be avoided. Linda set the menu down with a dull thud. "Here you go," she said, voice as flat as the tabletop. "This is what we have." No napkin placed carefully, No pulled-out chair. Just a half-second pause before she turned away without waiting for acknowledgement, already done with her statement. Jasmine stood still, staring at the seat, her jaw tight but her face composed. Her eyes didn't follow Linda. They swept the room once more. The contrast of laughter, soft conversations, and candlelight behind her, versus the noise, the smell, and the subtle rejection surrounding her. She could have refused the table, could have walked out, demanded to see the manager, posted the experience online in real time, but she didn't. With quiet defiance, she pulled out the chair herself and sat down, slow and deliberate. It wasn't a table anymore. It was a spotlight, and she chose to stay in it. This wasn't clumsiness. It wasn't a simple oversight. It was intentional, and it was rehearsed. 1,000 versions of Linda had done this before, to people who looked tired, dressed differently, didn't fit the mold. The only difference was, this time, the person in the hoodie was watching everything and forgetting nothing. The menu was thick and heavy, wrapped in soft leather with gold-embossed lettering. Jasmine opened it calmly, letting her eyes move slowly across each page as the distant chatter of the dining room buzzed like white noise around her. Linda stood across the table, arms crossed loosely over her notepad, fingers tapping the pen with rehearsed disinterest. She hadn't offered a smile, not even a pretense of hospitality. In her eyes, this was a formality, a box to check before the inevitable embarrassment unfolded. But Jasmine gave her nothing. No uncertainty, no hesitation, no apology. After a moment of silence, Jasmine looked up, eyes clear and focused, and said, "I'll have the A5 Japanese Wagyu, medium rare." A pause, just long enough for it to settle, and a glass of Chateau Margaux. The 2015, for a split second, Linda froze. A muscle jumped in her jaw. The shift was subtle, but it was there. A short, involuntary laugh escaped her lips, as if she couldn't help herself. "The Wagyu," she echoed, eyebrows rising. "And the Margaux?" She emphasized each syllable like she was sounding out a foreign language for someone unfamiliar. "Just making sure," she said, flipping her notepad open. "The Wagyu entree is $310, and the wine is $120 a glass." Her voice was neutral, but it was too careful, too pronounced. Every word loaded with subtext. "Are you sure you can afford that?" Jasmine didn't blink. "Yes," she said. "That's what I'd like." Her tone wasn't aggressive, but it was unshakable, like a woman who had been challenged before and long ago stopped justifying herself. Linda clicked her pen once, writing the order down in exaggerated strokes, then glanced up again. "Well," she said, "it's a very rich cut, not to everyone's taste." Her smile was dry, not kind, not warm, just tight and polite enough to avoid being quoted. "You might want to consider something lighter. The sea bass, perhaps. Less intense." She said intense, like it meant overwhelming, like she was doing Jasmine a favor by guiding her back to something safer, simpler, cheaper. But Jasmine only leaned back slightly in her chair, the dim light catching on the raindrops still clinging to her sleeve. "I've had it before," she replied evenly. "I'll stick with the Wagyu." The answer was soft, but it landed with weight. Linda's eyes narrowed for a heartbeat, then she smiled, this time visibly forced, and closed her notepad with a snap. "Very well," she said. "Let's hope the kitchen does it justice." The dig was subtle, but it was there. "If you even know what justice tastes like." She turned without waiting for a response, her heels striking the tile floor like punctuation. As she walked away, Jasmine watched her go, not with anger, but with the practiced awareness of a woman who had spent her life in rooms full of people who underestimated her. She could feel the eyes from two nearby tables, one couple whispering behind raised wine glasses, another man pausing mid-bite as if unsure whether he was watching a quiet act of rebellion or a slow-burn confrontation in progress. But Jasmine didn't move. She didn't shrink. She gently folded the menu, placed it beside her water glass, and looked down at the table in front of her. At the flickering candle, the cloth napkin, the empty plate that would soon carry the most expensive dish on the menu. She didn't just claim the meal, She claimed the space, and in a room built to push people like her to the edges, that act alone was revolutionary. From her table tucked in the shadow of the kitchen doors, Jasmine remained still, composed, but fully aware that every decision made around her had been deliberate. The noise from the back, the clatter of pots, the shouts from line cooks, bled into her space like static, swallowing the gentle music that filled the rest of the restaurant. She wasn't in a corner. She was in a different world, just a few feet away. Diners across the room sipped their Bordeaux under golden chandeliers, smiling over caviar and foie gras. But here at this table there were no soft lights, no view, no comfort, just a candle flickering unevenly, casting shadows across a white tablecloth that no one had cared to smooth. And someone noticed. He'd been watching since Jasmine walked in. A man in his late 60s, seated near the center of the room, silver hair neatly combed, cufflinks catching the candlelight. He didn't crane his neck or squint. He didn't whisper. He just watched silently, like a veteran recognizing a battle others pretended not to see. He had seen the delay in service, the tone in Linda's voice, the distance between Jasmine's table and every other guest. And something about it hit him the wrong way. Maybe it was the way she didn't flinch. Maybe it was the quiet dignity in how she asked for nothing more than a meal and was still treated like she didn't belong. He stood, not abruptly, not to make a scene, but with measured purpose. The kind of movement that draws attention precisely because it wasn't trying to. Glass in hand, he stepped through the dining room with the quiet weight of someone used to commanding a room without raising his voice. When he reached her table, he paused, not looming, not pitying, just present. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low, steady, every syllable chosen with care. "I couldn't help but notice you've been seated somewhere less than appropriate." His eyes scanned the corridor behind her, the restroom sign, the swinging door, the stain on the floor tile no one had cleaned. "My table's open, if you'd prefer. It would be my honor." Jasmine looked up slowly. For a moment she didn't speak. Her face didn't soften or tighten. She simply held his gaze, reading the man, sensing no performance, only principle. The room was quieter now, not silent, but tense. The kind of quiet where everyone pretends not to listen while doing exactly that. Her reply came gently, but without hesitation. "I appreciate that," she said, "more than you know." She glanced around, not at the room, but at the space she had been assigned. Her table, her place, chosen by someone else's judgment. "But I think I'll stay right here." She didn't smile politely. She didn't ask again. She claimed her seat the way someone claims their voice in a courtroom, calmly, firmly, and without permission. The older man held her gaze a moment longer, then gave a short, respectful nod. There was no offense, no pressure, just understanding. "You've got more grace than most of us," he said quietly, almost to himself. Then he turned and walked back to his table, each step deliberate, his back straight, as if he too had made a choice not to stay silent. As he sat down, he looked across the restaurant, not at Jasmine, but at Linda, still hovering near the server station with a frozen expression. His expression had changed now. It wasn't angry. It was disappointed. The kind of disappointment that lingers. And as he raised his glass, he gave a quiet toast in Jasmine's direction. Not for the wine, not for the steak, but for her refusal to be moved. The moment the older gentleman returned to his table, the atmosphere in the restaurant changed. It wasn't loud or obvious. Nobody clapped. Nobody gasped. But the silence was different now. People still talked. Forks still scraped against plates. But the air felt heavier, more aware. Jasmine didn't look around. She didn't shift in her seat. She simply picked up her fork again, cut a small piece of the wagyu, and placed it on her tongue as if she were alone in the room. She chewed slowly, intentionally, taking her time, not because she wanted to savor the food, but because she refused to be rushed, refused to be pushed out. She knew exactly what was happening and what kind of place she had walked into. And even now, sitting in the worst seat in the house, she would not let anyone see her flinch. Linda returned just as Jasmine was taking her second bite. Her walk was slower now, deliberate, with the kind of forced calm that hides frustration. Her smile looked polite, but anyone paying attention would have seen the tension in her jaw. She stopped beside Jasmine's table and tilted her head slightly. "How's everything?" she asked, the tone too sweet, too rehearsed. Jasmine looked up briefly, met her eyes, and responded with a simple, "Very good, thank you." That should have been enough, but Linda didn't leave. She lingered, arms crossed behind her back, eyes scanning the plate. "The Wagyu is, quite a choice," she said, her voice light but not warm. "Very rich, very intense." She chuckled softly like she was making an inside joke only she understood. "Not something everyone can handle." Jasmine didn't answer right away. She calmly lifted her wineglass, took a slow sip, and set it down gently on the white linen tablecloth. "It's exactly what I wanted," she said, her tone even, steady. Linda's smile tightened. She nodded once as if checking a box, then added, "We've had people send it back before. Sometimes it's too fatty, too overwhelming." She didn't say it out loud, but the suggestion was clear. "You probably won't finish it. You probably can't afford it. You probably ordered it just to make a point." Jasmine looked at her silent, not angry, not amused, just still. A couple sitting nearby exchanged a glance. The woman leaned in slightly and whispered something to her partner. He turned his head slowly, pretending to look toward the kitchen, but his eyes paused on Jasmine's table. A man sitting at the bar looked up from his phone and stared openly, no longer pretending not to watch. But Linda didn't see any of it. Or maybe she did and didn't care. She leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice like she was sharing a secret. "If you prefer something lighter, we have an excellent halibut dish. Or the filet mignon. It's simpler." Jasmine finally set down her fork. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't use harsh words. She just looked at Linda with the calm of someone who had been through worse and learned exactly when silence speaks loudest. "I'll stick with the Wagyu," she said, "but thank you." That moment held longer than it should have. Linda opened her mouth as if to say something else, then seemed to think better of it. She gave a short, almost dismissive nod and walked away. Her posture was stiffer now, her pace quicker, and that's when it really changed. The room didn't fall silent, but the conversations around Jasmine started to shift. A woman in a red dress sitting 2 tables over set her fork down and stared toward the server station. A man near the window leaned slightly in his seat, his expression suddenly alert. People weren't just watching Jasmine anymore. They were watching Linda. The injustice wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was clear. Jasmine picked up her fork again and kept eating, bite by bite, each motion smooth and deliberate. The noise of the kitchen door swinging behind her, the faint buzz from the flickering light above, the chatter from the other diners. It was all there, but it no longer mattered. Her focus stayed where it had been since she walked in, centered, unshaken. Linda reappeared once more to refill the water glass. She didn't say anything this time. She just leaned over, poured quickly, and turned away. But her movements were tense, sharper than before. Across the room, the older gentleman who had offered his table raised his glass again in Jasmine's direction. Not dramatically, not to draw attention, just a small, respectful gesture. Jasmine noticed. She offered a slight nod in return. Another couple whispered to their server. Their eyes darted toward Jasmine's table, then back to their menus. The server nodded, face tight, and walked off quickly. Linda stood behind the bar now, arms folded, watching Jasmine from a distance. Her face was harder to read. Maybe she realized she'd gone too far. Maybe she didn't care. Maybe she wasn't used to someone staying calm when they were supposed to crack. But Jasmine didn't crack. She finished her steak slowly, sipping the wine between each bite, like time itself had no control over her. She wasn't performing. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She was simply refusing to be diminished. And that, more than anything, was what unsettled everyone. By now, the energy in the restaurant had shifted completely. What started as whispers at 1 or 2 tables had spread like a slow-moving wave. Servers leaned in closer when guests beckoned them, nodding quickly before slipping off behind the scenes. People weren't just annoyed anymore. They were disturbed. Even those who hadn't seen what happened from the beginning could feel it. Something unfair had taken place, and the silence that followed was too heavy to ignore. Eventually, enough had been said that no manager in any fine dining establishment could afford to remain out of sight, and so the curtain near the rear hallway parted. The manager stepped out with a calm, professional air, his suit crisp, his shoulders square. He had the look of someone used to controlling the tone of a room, someone who solved problems with firm handshakes and quiet apologies. As he moved toward the center of the dining room, his eyes scanned the floor quickly, trying to read the room. He noticed the unease, the unnatural stillness at certain tables, the eyes flicking toward a single corner of the space. And then he saw her. At first, all he registered was the table placement, the far back, right next to the swinging kitchen door, where the lights flickered and the scent of bleach crept into the air. It was clearly a mistake. A guest should never be seated there unless the dining room was completely full. And tonight, it wasn't. But the moment he saw Jasmine Crockett's face, he stopped walking. Recognition hit him like a punch to the chest. Jasmine Crockett. He had seen her name more than once. Not on guest lists, but on court dockets and television screens. She was the attorney who had challenged unconstitutional policing in Texas. The woman who had stood in front of a federal panel and argued with such calm force that the room fell silent. A name connected with justice, progress, power. Someone who had built her reputation not through wealth or fame, but through the clarity of her words and the strength of her convictions. And now, she was here, in his restaurant, in the worst seat in the house. A cold realization settled in his stomach. He didn't need to ask what happened. He didn't need to know what was said or how it was said. The very fact that she had been seated there, dressed simply, unrecognized, told him everything. Someone had judged her by her appearance. Someone had made a decision based on the surface. And now the consequences of that mistake were staring him straight in the face. He exhaled slowly and continued walking, this time with a different posture. No longer confident, but careful, respectful, intentional. The clinking of cutlery slowed as he passed through the center of the dining room. People turned their heads. Some watched him with expectation, others with quiet satisfaction. The room, once indifferent, now felt like it was waiting. When he reached Jasmine's table, he didn't force a smile. He stopped just beside her and spoke in a quiet, clear tone. "Ms. Crockett," he said, "I truly didn't know you were dining with us tonight. I'm very sorry for what's happened." Jasmine looked up. Her expression was unreadable. Calm, composed, but not surprised. She'd seen this pattern before. Silence, dismissal, then sudden recognition. She set her fork down gently and met his gaze. "You shouldn't need to know who I am," she said, voice low but firm. "I shouldn't have to be someone to be treated like someone." And in that moment, the entire restaurant heard her. Not just her words, but the truth in them. The manager's face was still tight with embarrassment, his words carefully measured. He looked like a man trying to reverse damage he hadn't personally caused, but now had no choice but to own. The weight of the room was on him. Not just the eyes of the guests, but the energy, the discomfort, the knowing. He stood next to Jasmine's table, hands clasped in front of him like a man offering peace, respect, and an escape route all at once. "Ms. Crockett," he said, voice low and almost pleading, "please let us move you to a better table, near the front, by the window. We'll reset the space for you immediately. The meal, of course, is on us. We want to make this right." The words hung there, almost desperate in tone. A few diners shifted in their seats. Some looked at Jasmine, waiting for her to accept. Others looked down, quietly hoping she wouldn't. Because by now, everyone understood this wasn't just about a chair, or a view, or a free dinner. It was about something larger. And Jasmine, still seated in the same uncomfortable chair, next to the kitchen door, beneath the flickering light, had understood that from the moment she was shown to the table. She placed her fork down gently, not with frustration, but with purpose. Then she looked up, not at the restaurant, not at the guests, but directly at the manager, her eyes steady and focused. "Thank you," she said, voice soft but sharp with clarity. "But I'll finish my meal here." The manager blinked, caught off guard. He hadn't expected that. He nodded slowly, but Jasmine wasn't finished. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It carried. Not because it was loud, but because it was clear, intentional. It had the stillness of a closing argument. "I didn't walk in here asking to be treated special. she said. I didn't announce who I was. I didn't expect fanfare or favors or attention. I came here the same way any person would, hungry, tired, and willing to pay for a quiet meal. Her tone remained even, but the room grew quieter with every word. And what I got, she continued, was judgment. A decision made before I sat down, based on how I looked, based on what someone assumed I couldn't afford, based on who they thought I wasn't. The manager swallowed hard. No reply came. There was nothing to say. Jasmine's words weren't an accusation. They were a simple truth. And that's what made them hit harder than anything loud or angry could. She glanced down briefly at the white tablecloth, the flickering candlelight reflecting off her water glass, then back at him. The way a person is treated when you think they're no one, she said, voice slow and firm, reveals the real character of a place, not the service for the VIPs, not the smiles for the celebrities, but what happens when a customer walks in with nothing but her name and no one knows it. A few people at nearby tables had put down their forks entirely. A woman in her 50s dabbed at her eye with a cloth napkin. A man near the back shook his head, jaw clenched. I'm not moving, Jasmine finished, because this isn't just about me. It's about everyone who walks through those doors and gets judged the same way. And I want you to remember what this moment looked like. Not when you recognized my name, but when you didn't. She sat back, calm as ever. Not defiant, not victorious, just present, whole, refusing to be erased by politeness after being dismissed by prejudice. The manager nodded, slowly, heavily. His shoulders dropped slightly, as if the truth had reached his core. Yes, ma'am, he said quietly. You're right, and I'm deeply sorry. Jasmine said nothing in response. She didn't need to. The silence around them said enough. In that moment, it was clear. No better table could restore what had already been lost, and no apology could undo what had already been seen. The restaurant had returned to its rhythm, but the room hadn't forgotten. Guests filtered out with quiet nods and half-hearted smiles. They looked back more than once, not at the chandeliers, not at the valet, at that table by the kitchen, the one no one would ever forget again. Jasmine stayed until the dining room was empty. When the last chair had been tucked in and the lights dimmed to a softer glow, the manager gathered the entire staff in the main hall, just as she had asked. Servers stood beside bussers. Line cooks leaned against counters in their aprons. Even Linda was there, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, eyes fixed on the floor. No one spoke. No one dared. And then Jasmine walked in. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't command attention. She didn't have to. The room stilled the moment she stepped forward, still dressed in that same rain-damp hoodie, the same clothes that had once made her invisible. Now she stood at the center of the space like a courtroom she'd taken command of 1,000 times before. Her presence had shifted from quiet to undeniable. She looked around, meeting eyes where she could, letting the silence stretch just long enough for people to feel it. Not as pressure, but as reflection. I didn't come here tonight to teach a lesson, she began. I came here to eat. Her voice was low, but it carried. Every word landed clean, sharp. But what happened at that table, she said, wasn't new to me. It wasn't shocking. It wasn't even surprising. It was familiar. Too familiar. The staff stood silent, eyes on her. Some stiff, some ashamed. A few already blinking back something heavier. Jasmine took a breath and continued. I grew up in South Oak Cliff, she said. Not the part on real estate brochures. The part people cross the street to avoid. My mom worked nights. My dad left early. We didn't have much, but we had dignity. We were raised to sit up straight, speak clearly, and treat everyone, like they mattered. She paused, her gaze shifting toward Linda for the briefest moment before returning to the group. I was 9 the first time someone told me I didn't belong. It was a diner just off I-45. Nothing fancy. Vinyl booths, fluorescent lights. I had 5 crumpled dollars in my hand and a craving for pancakes. But when I walked in, the waitress looked me over, then pointed to the sign and said, "We're closed." She let that hang for a second. The place was half full. Someone coughed softly at the back. No one moved. I walked outside and sat on the curb, she said. I didn't cry. I just sat there, trying to figure out what I did wrong. What part of me made her lie? My clothes, my hair, my skin. Her voice never cracked. It didn't need to. The calm made it more devastating. And I remember thinking, maybe if I dressed differently next time, maybe if I spoke better, maybe if I had a parent with me. I didn't know it then, but I was already learning a rule that too many people live by. If they don't see your worth, make yourself smaller. Blend in. Avoid the spotlight. Don't make it worse. She looked at them again, not judging, just letting the weight of her words settle in their chest. But I stopped following that rule a long time ago, she said. I became a lawyer, not to prove anything, but because I needed to make space for people who never got the benefit of the doubt. Jasmine took a slow step forward, her voice now firm, her shoulders squared. What happened tonight wasn't about one bad seat or one server's decision. It was about something deeper, something learned. We judge people in seconds, their clothes, their voice, the way they carry themselves. We decide who matters based on what we expect important people to look like. She stopped, then added, slower now. And too often, when we think someone's a nobody, we treat them like nothing. Linda's breath hitched. She didn't look up. I didn't ask to be moved, Jasmine said, because I didn't want the lesson to be that when someone's important, we fix the problem. I wanted you to see the mistake before the name, before the title, before the apology. There was silence again, thick, dense, like the entire room had stopped breathing. I don't want anyone fired, she said clearly, but I do want something to change. She turned slightly, addressing the manager now. Build a culture here where dignity isn't conditional, where everyone gets the benefit of the doubt, where your staff doesn't have to guess who deserves good service, because everyone deserves it. The manager nodded slowly, chest rising with a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. And if you ever forget why that matters, Jasmine said, her voice softening just slightly, remember the girl sitting on that diner curb with $5 in her hand and no place to go? She stepped back, her posture calm, unshaken, whole. No applause followed, no one dared. What filled the room wasn't performance, it was truth. And that truth would stay long after Jasmine Crockett walked out the door. The room was still. Jasmine's final words had landed like a verdict, and no one dared to speak. The staff stood in tense silence, watching her, not with fear but with respect, maybe even something deeper. Linda, standing off to the side, looked smaller than before. Her arms hung stiff at her sides, her eyes red but dry. She hadn't moved. She hadn't spoken. Her silence wasn't defiant anymore. It was something closer to realization. Jasmine took a step toward her, not to corner her, not to shame her, but to confront the moment with the same unshakable calm she had carried since she walked through the front door. I'm not here to ruin someone's life, Jasmine said, her voice low but strong. That's not what justice looks like. Linda's eyes lifted slowly, almost afraid to meet hers. I'm not asking for you to be fired, Jasmine continued, but I am asking you to face what happened. Linda stood frozen. Her face paled under the weight of what she knew was coming, but Jasmine's tone never shifted into cruelty. It remained steady, like a closing argument with the jury watching. You will write a formal letter of acknowledgement, Jasmine said, not to me, but to this team, to your co-workers, the people who watched this unfold and stayed silent, maybe because they didn't know what else to do. You will own what happened. You will name it. No excuses. No soft language. The staff shifted slightly. Some nodded. One of the younger servers swallowed hard, suddenly breathing easier. And more than that, Jasmine said, you will complete a full program in inclusive hospitality, not a slideshow, not a 2-hour workshop, a real course, one that forces you to look inward, that teaches you why this matters when no one's watching, when the guest doesn't have a title, when they don't fight back. Linda blinked as if the words were cutting through something she had never allowed herself to feel. Yes, she whispered. I will. Jasmine stepped back slightly, turning now to face the entire team. Her gaze swept across them, Kitchen staff, hostesses, servers, people who had watched everything from the sidelines and now stood in quiet reflection. "You are the face of this place," she said. "Before the food, before the wine. You, your words, your posture, your tone. You decide whether someone feels welcome or warned. Dignity is not something that gets handed out only when it's convenient. It should be baked into every gesture." No one moved, no one interrupted. The weight of her words clung to the air like truth that had long been ignored. "I don't want you to remember my name tonight," Jasmine continued. "I want you to remember how easy it was to decide I didn't matter, and how wrong that decision was." Linda looked down, her shoulders slowly rising as she inhaled the hardest breath of her life. Jasmine didn't offer comfort. She didn't soften the blow. She offered something harder, the chance to do better. "I hope you take it," she said finally, "because the next guest may not speak up. They may just carry that wound with them, and they'll remember not the restaurant, not the food, but the feeling that they were invisible." With that, Jasmine turned and walked toward the door. No dramatics, no applause, just the sound of quiet footsteps on polished floors. She didn't look back. She didn't need to, because the room behind her wasn't the same anymore, and neither were the people inside it. Outside the restaurant, the night was calm. Jasmine walked into the darkness without ceremony, without cameras, without applause. Just the echo of her own footsteps on the wet pavement and the quiet hum of a city that had no idea what had just happened behind the glass. She didn't check her phone. She didn't speak. Her silence wasn't emptiness. It was intention. Inside, the staff still stood frozen, the weight of her words heavy in their chest. But outside, the world hadn't heard yet. That wouldn't last long. At a nearby table, a guest who had witnessed the entire night, start to finish, posted a single sentence on Twitter before paying the bill. "A woman walked into a five-star restaurant tonight, was treated like a nobody, and left as the most powerful person in the room." Underneath, they added a short video. 24 seconds of Jasmine standing before the staff saying calmly, "The way someone treats a guest they think is no one. That's who they really are. No filter, no edits, just raw truth." By morning, it had more than 2 million views. News outlets picked it up like dry grass catching flame. Civil rights attorney shamed at elite restaurant responds with grace. The viral moment that exposed everyday bias in luxury spaces. Who is Jasmine Crockett, and why her silence speaks louder than outrage? Blogs dissected her tone. Podcasts analyzed her posture. Comment sections filled with praise, anger, confession. Some recounted their own moments of being dismissed, overlooked, humiliated for not looking the part. Others admitted they had been on the other side of that exchange, silently complicit or worse. One user wrote, "I've been that server. I've looked at people and decided they didn't matter. I'm done with that. She changed me." Another said, "We keep waiting for kindness to shout, but it's the quiet kind that cracks the walls." The restaurant, L'Atelier, posted a statement by noon, a formal apology to Jasmine Crockett, and a public announcement that all staff would undergo inclusive hospitality training immediately. But the damage and the awakening had already begun. Jasmine hadn't said a word online, no posts, no selfies, no hashtags. She didn't need to, because the world was speaking for her now. In classrooms, teachers played her speech to students during morning homeroom. In corporate training sessions, HR reps cited her as a case study in dignity, professionalism, and emotional leadership. Law students watched the video in ethics lectures, not because she won a case, but because she embodied the verdict without ever going to court. She hadn't raised her voice once, but her presence had shaken the foundation of an industry built on assumptions. What hit people the hardest wasn't just the injustice. It was how familiar it was, how quietly it had happened, how often it goes unnoticed unless someone refuses to leave the table they've been pushed to. She had done nothing theatrical. She didn't yell. She didn't storm out. She didn't throw her title around or demand punishment. She just stayed seated. And that act of refusing to move when made to feel small was what lit the fire. Late-night hosts mentioned her in monologues. Celebrities quoted her words in stories. A major airline even reached out privately to ask if she would consult on customer experience policy. But Jasmine didn't answer right away. She wasn't in a rush to monetize what had happened. She wasn't interested in being a symbol. She was interested in impact. Meanwhile, at L'Atelier, things had changed. Guests of all backgrounds began showing up, more diverse than ever before, not to shame the restaurant, but to see if it truly had changed. And in a quiet moment one evening, Linda stood at that same table near the kitchen, now reset and polished like every other in the room, and greeted a guest with a genuine smile, not one rehearsed. The guest wore a hoodie, their shoes were worn, and Linda didn't flinch. Because some lessons aren't learned by punishment, they're learned by being allowed to face what you almost ruined and fix it. And so the story of one night in Dallas, one woman, one meal, one moment, rippled far beyond the walls of a luxury restaurant. It became more than viral content. It became a mirror, a reminder that the smallest actions, how you seat someone, how you speak to them, how you look at them when you think no one is watching, are everything. And that one quiet woman, who didn't walk in looking like power, had walked out having redefined it forever. After Jasmine walked out of the restaurant and the last staff member slowly filed out of the main floor, the air in the building remained thick, not with sound, but with the residue of truth. No one said much. A few exchanged glances. A few looked down. The room had been emptied, but something had been left behind. A feeling they couldn't name, but couldn't ignore. Linda didn't leave with the others. She slipped quietly into the back, past the kitchen, past the dry storage, and into the narrow, dimly lit staff locker room. The noise of the restaurant faded behind the thick door. In here, the air was still, cold. The fluorescent light above flickered slightly, just like the one over Jasmine's table earlier that night, as if the building itself remembered. Linda sat down slowly on the wooden bench beside her locker. Her hands were shaking. She tried to unbutton her uniform vest, but her fingers couldn't seem to follow the command. And then, without warning, the tears came. Not loud, not dramatic, just a steady, quiet stream. The kind you don't fight, because you know you've been holding them back for far too long. Her shoulders curled inward, as if trying to protect something fragile inside her that had been cracked wide open. She didn't sob. She didn't scream. She just broke, alone, until she wasn't. From the far end of the locker room, a soft voice spoke. "Hey," it said, careful, gentle. "Can I sit?" It was Mara, one of the younger servers. Early 20s, new to the team. Kind, observant. The one who always offered to cover doubles, who remembered regulars' favorite drinks even when they didn't. Linda nodded without lifting her head. Mara sat down beside her without another word. The silence stretched for a long minute, just the sound of breathing, shallow and uneven. Then Linda spoke. "I used to work in a bar," she said, voice hoarse and quiet. 5 nights a week, dive place, neon lights, sticky floors, not classy, but it paid rent. Mara didn't interrupt. "There was this one guy," Linda continued, "came in wearing a Rolex and a suit that probably cost more than my car. He snapped his fingers to get my attention. Called me sweetheart. Laughed when I mispronounced the wine label. Told his friend I was exactly what you'd expect in a place like this." Her jaw tightened, and I smiled. I smiled and nodded and poured his drink like it didn't matter. But it did. It stuck. She looked down at her hands. And I promised myself I would never let someone make me feel like that again. Never. Mara finally spoke. Her voice was soft. "So you built walls?" Linda nodded. With sarcasm, with control, with judgment. Another pause. "I told myself it wasn't personal," she said, "that it was protection, that I was just reading people fast. But tonight, Jasmine wasn't rude. She wasn't loud. She wasn't even asking for anything. And I saw her and I decided she was trouble. Just like that." Her voice cracked. "I profiled her, Mara. I did exactly what that man did to me. I looked at her clothes and thought, she doesn't belong. Not because of anything she said, but because of what I assumed." She wiped her face quickly, ashamed of the tears but unable to stop them. "And when she spoke to me, I heard my own words come back at me, but smarter. calmer, stronger. And I realized something I never thought I'd have to say out loud. Mara leaned in, waiting. I've become the kind of person I used to hate. The sentence hit like a confession dragged out from the deepest part of her. The part she'd buried under layers of experience, frustration, pride, and fear. She had spent years perfecting a version of herself that couldn't be looked down on, and in doing so, had started looking down on others before they had the chance to do it first. I thought being sharp would protect me, Linda whispered, but it made me sharp to other people. I made someone feel small tonight, and I did it on autopilot. Mara placed a hand gently on her shoulder, not to comfort, just to be there. That's not who you are forever, Mara said. Linda shook her head. No, but it's who I was tonight, and I'll carry that. She stared ahead at the blank wall, blinking. But I'm not going to run from it. Jasmine didn't humiliate me. She didn't yell. She didn't even name me in that speech. She gave me a mirror, and now I have to look in it. The locker room remained silent after that, but it wasn't empty. There was something in Linda now. Not relief, not clarity, but responsibility. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't building walls. She was lowering them, slowly, carefully, brick by brick. And in the quiet that followed, she didn't feel like a villain. She felt like a human being finally waking up. And that more than anything was the beginning. A month passed. The world moved on, but not quite the same. Inside L'Atelier, something subtle but unmistakable had shifted. It wasn't in the decor, which still gleamed with polished wood and low amber light. It wasn't in the food, which still arrived on plates like artwork. The change was in the air, in the way voices lowered not out of superiority but to make room for others, in how staff now looked at guests, not to size them up but to truly see them. And then, on a quiet Wednesday evening, just as the early dinner crowd was beginning to trickle in, the door opened. No announcement, no reservation. Just the soft creak of the brass handle and the sound of footsteps across marble. She wore the same dark hoodie. Her shoes were still plain, hair tied back, no makeup, no entourage, no fanfare. Jasmine Crockett had returned. The hostess stand was momentarily empty. A server passed by, not recognizing her, then paused, not from shock, but from recognition, not of fame, but of presence. He said nothing, simply gave a polite nod and moved toward the back. Linda appeared from the hallway a second later. She was in uniform, crisp and neat, hair pulled back in a tight, elegant bun, a pen tucked into the edge of her apron pocket. Calm, prepared, but not performative. When she saw Jasmine standing there, her breath caught, not in fear but in focus. And then she smiled. Not the strained, tight-lipped kind of a person trying to suppress judgment. It was full, genuine, open. "Good evening," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Welcome back." Jasmine tilted her head slightly, just a trace of surprise in her eyes. She didn't reply at first, watching carefully, like someone waiting to see which version of a person they're speaking to. Linda held her gaze, steady, unblinking, but warm. "We've got a table open by the window," she continued. "Beautiful view at this hour. And the kitchen just rolled out a new entree. Mandarin glazed roast chicken with citrus confit and charred herbs. It's bright, bold, worth the risk." For a moment, the entire restaurant felt like it had gone still again, just like it had that night. But this stillness wasn't tense. It was waiting. Jasmine looked her in the eye, long enough to remember the person who once met her with a stare full of suspicion. And then slowly she smiled. Just a little. "I see you've changed the lighting in here," she said softly. Linda let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "We've changed a few things," Jasmine nodded. "And yourself?" Linda straightened her posture, but her tone didn't rise. "Working on it every day." That earned her a raised brow, amused but respectful. Jasmine stepped forward. "I'll take that table by the window." "Of course," Linda replied. "And something tells me you'll want the Mandarin chicken." Jasmine chuckled. "You read people a little differently these days." I tried to. Linda gestured gently, leading her toward the front of the restaurant, not the back. This time, Jasmine walked past full tables and curious glances, but none of it felt hostile. Just curious, maybe even admiring. No one reached for phones. No whispers buzzed. There was only the hum of humanity learning from its own missteps. And as Jasmine sat, placing her napkin across her lap with quiet precision, a voice rose gently from the far side of the room. It was the older gentleman, the same one who had offered his table weeks earlier. He was seated in the same place, alone this time, wine glass in hand. He raised it slowly toward Jasmine, his eyes kind but firm. "Ms. Crockett," he said, loud enough for only a few nearby tables to hear. "Thank you." She turned her head slightly. "For what?" she asked, her voice soft. He smiled, lifting the glass higher. "For teaching this place something money can't buy." The words landed like a final line in a courtroom, a truth that could never be disputed. "Kindness," he added, "and what it really looks like." Jasmine gave him a nod. Not grand, not theatrical. Just a quiet acknowledgement between two people who had seen the best and worst in others. Linda returned moments later with a watercraft and 2 menus, but she didn't rush. She placed the glass gently. She unfolded the napkin beside the plate with a quiet touch. Jasmine watched her, but said nothing. When Linda looked up, she met Jasmine's eyes and smiled again. No longer seeking forgiveness, just showing up differently. "This one's on me," she said quietly. Jasmine shook her head. "No, that's not why I came back." Linda blinked, caught. "I came back," Jasmine continued, "to see if this place could live up to the moment it was given." "And?" Linda asked, voice barely above a whisper. "You just did." No applause followed, no cameras flashed. But for the second time in a single dining room, something had changed. Not in volume, not in cost, but in value. This time, Jasmine didn't need to stay long. She had already been served. As Jasmine rose from her seat and made her way back out through the restaurant's front doors, the night greeted her with the same stillness as the one a month before. But everything else had changed. Inside, the lights still glowed warm. Glasses clinked, plates were cleared. But more importantly, people were listening now. Not just hearing, but seeing. Because this time, they knew what they were witnessing. Not a dramatic victory, not a viral moment, but a choice. And that choice, one woman's refusal to let bitterness shape her response to injustice, became something no luxury, no status, no polished service could ever match. This was never just a story about a restaurant. This was about a system, built on assumptions, the kind of assumptions that sneak in through polished smiles and curated spaces, that hide behind phrases like standards or professionalism, but what they really mean is who looks like they belong and who doesn't. Jasmine never asked for special treatment. She didn't raise her voice or demand recognition. She simply walked in with a hunger for peace and was met with judgment dressed in silk. And what happened next was not the fight we expect. It was something rarer. It was grace without surrender, truth without rage. She sat in the seat they tried to shame her into, and she stayed. That decision, to remain seated in a space that tried to make her feel small, became the moment the room was forced to look at itself. The injustice she faced was quiet. No slurs, no screams. Just a tone, a glance, a table by the restroom. But that's what made it more dangerous, because it happens every day. To people without names that make headlines. To those who carry themselves with dignity, but not enough polish to pass the invisible test. The test of being worth serving. What Jasmine showed the world, and especially the people in that room, is that the deepest kind of respect is owed not to titles, but to humanity. The way we treat someone when we think they have nothing to offer us reveals everything about who we are. We live in a world that rewards performance. We're taught to judge quickly: clothes, posture, presence. We scan people like price tags, and too often we confuse kindness with weakness. Or worse, we save it for those we think can return it. But that's not kindness. That's calculation. True compassion, The kind that changes people, asks for something more. The willingness to show respect before it's earned. To lead with empathy, even when the room doesn't demand it. Jasmine didn't just ask for that standard. She embodied it. And in doing so, she exposed what so many places are afraid to admit. That some of the most prestigious spaces in our world are still built on quiet exclusion. The waitress who mistreated her wasn't evil. She was conditioned. Conditioned to see wealth as virtue. Conditioned to see unpolished as undeserving. Conditioned to associate respect with reward, not with right. But Jasmine's greatest power wasn't in calling that out with fire. It was in holding up a mirror, standing calmly and asking, "Is this who you want to be?" And the most beautiful part? They listened, because that's the real impact of courage. Not when it demands applause, but when it leaves people so still they have no choice but to hear the truth echoing in their own silence. That night became more than a memory. It became a lesson, a test passed down to anyone who works a front desk, takes an order, offers a seat, or answers a phone. It became a quiet voice whispering in the back of someone's mind the next time a guest walks in, looking tired or out of place, or not our usual clientele. And that voice will ask, will you serve them with dignity, or will you assume they haven't earned it yet? Jasmine's return 1 month later wasn't a victory lap. It was a checkpoint, a moment to see if the story had left the screen and made its way into the soil. And it had. Because the woman who once met her with narrowed eyes and veiled contempt greeted her with warmth. Not performative polish, real warmth. Not because Jasmine was now famous, but because Linda had finally understood the damage of assumption. She hadn't just apologized. She had transformed. And that is something money cannot buy. It's something only truth can plant. This is the message that lingers long after the story ends. Dignity cannot be requested. It must be offered. Upfront, no conditions, no reservations. Service is not just about plates and silverware. It's about posture, intention, and the unspoken message behind every smile or side eye. A job in hospitality, or any public-facing work, is a sacred position because it grants us the power to shape how someone sees themselves in a moment where they are vulnerable. And that power must be handled with care. Whether you're working the counter, running a boardroom, managing a call center, or teaching a classroom, you have that power to lift, to see, or to shrink and dismiss. So the next time someone walks through your door looking like they don't belong, ask yourself, what if they're the one who's about to change everything? Because sometimes the most powerful person in the room isn't the one who looks the part. It's the one who walks in with nothing, but leaves you with something you'll never forget. And that is the kind of kindness that doesn't just soften a room. It rebuilds it, brick by brick, person by person, table by table. So now that you've heard the story, seen it unfold like a quiet battle behind the walls of fine dining and flawless etiquette, the question becomes, what will you do the next time it's your turn? Because make no mistake, you will have a turn. Maybe not in a luxury restaurant, maybe not with someone like Jasmine Crockett, but you will face a moment where you'll have to decide, do I lead with assumption or with humanity? Do I size someone up by what they wear, how they speak, where they sit? Or do I choose to look deeper, even when no one's watching? These aren't just grand gestures. They're small decisions, a tone of voice, a second of eye contact, the difference between seating someone near the restroom or by the window. These are the choices that build a culture, not just in restaurants, but in hospitals, classrooms, boardrooms, offices, airports, and front porches. And the truth is, injustice doesn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes it comes dressed in politeness, in silence, in the absence of welcome. So this is your moment now, to reflect, to adjust, and to act. Whether you're a manager, a server, a customer, or just a stranger passing by, you hold the power to shape how someone feels about themselves, even for just a second. And that second might stay with them forever. Let that second be one of dignity, one of warmth, one of seeing, not judging. Because the next Jasmine you meet won't announce herself. She'll walk in quietly, sit where you place her, and leave with a memory you helped create. Make sure it's the kind of memory the world could learn from. The world doesn't need more polished service. It needs more courageous kindness. And it starts with you, right here, right now. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. Edward Mitchell, 73, was publicly humiliated at his local bank, mocked, ignored, and treated like a burden. No one came to his defense until Jasmine Crockett, a fearless black civil rights attorney, stepped through the door. Within just 5 minutes, she turned the entire bank upside down. What did Jasmine uncover, buried in plain sight, that the bank had spent years desperately trying to keep hidden from the public? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The bank was a pressure cooker, crowded, noisy, intense. Customers shuffled in long lines, sighing, muttering, checking watches. The buzz of printers and muffled conversations filled the air. At the back, Edward Mitchell stood quietly, almost lost in the chaos. His white hair was neatly combed, his clothes simple but clean. In his hands, a worn brown envelope, bent at the corners, packed with old receipts and printed statements, was all he had. A retired civil engineer, now living alone, he depended entirely on his modest pension. Edward's heart beat faster with each passing minute. The unexpected fees on his account had shaken him, small at first, then growing. He hadn't been warned, and now every dollar mattered. Still, he believed it was a mistake. "I just need to explain," he whispered to himself, gripping the envelope tighter. "They'll understand," he told himself quietly. "They'll fix it. It has to be a mistake." But as he looked around, at the impatient faces and indifferent staff, doubt crept in. He wasn't sure if anyone would truly listen, or if they ever had. But Edward's hope began to falter. The moment he reached the counter, he shuffled forward slowly, trying not to hold up the line behind him, clutching his worn envelope like a lifeline. Behind the plexiglass sat Lindsay Cooper, mid-20s, glossy hair, heavy mascara, a smartphone practically fused to her hand. Her eyes were locked on the screen, thumbs moving fast, too fast to be work-related. Her neon pink nails tapped the glass counter, in rhythm with her scrolling. Edward hesitated for a second, then gently cleared his throat. She didn't look up, not right away. When she finally did, it was with a sigh that seemed disproportionate to the situation, like someone being asked to pause an important meeting, not a text conversation. Her eyes met Edward's for a brief, hollow second, then dropped to the brown envelope in his hand. He forced a small smile, the kind that carried more anxiety than warmth, and slid a printed statement toward her, with careful hands. "Excuse me, miss," he said softly, voice gravelly with age, but steady. "I noticed some new charges on my account. I don't quite understand what they're for. I was hoping someone could help me go over them." Lindsay glanced at the page, didn't even pick it up. Her expression didn't change. No confusion, no curiosity, no concern, just indifference. She lazily leaned forward, tapped a few keys on her keyboard, then said flatly, "That's the monthly maintenance fee." No greeting, no explanation, just a verdict. Edward blinked, unsure if he'd misheard her. "I've had this account for over 15 years, he said, trying to stay calm. "I've never been charged that before. Not once." He adjusted his posture, instinctively straightening his back, the way he used to, when presenting engineering reports to project boards. "There must have been some kind of change I wasn't informed about." Lindsay finally picked up the paper, but only to slide it back across the counter with a fingernail. She didn't bother hiding the condescension in her voice. "It's in the agreement you signed. Maybe you just didn't read the fine print." That stung. Edward's eyebrows drew in slightly, not with anger, but with shame. He had read the paperwork years ago, when his eyesight was sharper, and the world felt less hostile. Now, everything felt like a trick, hidden behind asterisks and legalese. I did read it, he replied gently, but this wasn't there, and no one at the branch ever mentioned any changes to me. Lindsay shrugged. We're not required to notify you in person. That's what the emails are for. I don't use email, Edward admitted quietly. I've always come here to speak with someone directly. That's how I manage my account. Lindsay smirked, not cruelly, just dismissively. Well, that's kind of the problem, isn't it? She folded her arms. You're a little out of touch with how things work these days. The words landed like a slap. Edward felt his ears burn, not from heat, but humiliation. He heard someone behind him shift, impatiently. Maybe someone sighed, maybe not. But in that moment, it felt like the whole room was watching an old man lose control over something as basic as his own money. He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. His throat felt tight. His hands, still gripping the envelope, had started to tremble ever so slightly. Lindsay looked past him, at the next customer in line. Is there anything else I can help you with? She asked as if the matter was closed, but the words hit harder than Edward expected, sharper, colder, and far more public than he was prepared for. For a split second, there was silence, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that echoes right before a room shifts, before judgment creeps in. Then came the first signs, a subtle clearing of the throat from the man 2 people back, the soft whisper of clothing as someone leaned sideways, craning their neck for a better look. A middle-aged woman near the ATM nudged her partner and nodded toward the counter. Eyebrows lifted. The man beside her gave a crooked half smile, amused, and then it spread, like wildfire. Tiny movements, stolen glances, the soundless exchange of reactions, the kind of moment where no one says anything out loud, but everyone's already decided what side they're on. Edward felt it all, the invisible weight of every eye that landed on him, the tiny tick of disapproval, the irritation at the delay, the assumptions, forming without context. In their eyes, he wasn't a man standing up for fairness. He was an old man who didn't get how things worked, an inconvenience. His heart pounded, not from anger, but from the suffocating sense that he had just been labeled in front of strangers, reduced, ridiculed, unwelcome. He shifted awkwardly, trying to move aside without drawing more attention. But his legs felt stiff, his body heavy. He could hear someone exhale sharply behind him, a sigh that wasn't just impatience, it was judgment. Lindsay, still behind the glass, had already turned her attention elsewhere, her fingers now dancing, back over her phone. To her, the moment was over. Case closed. But for Edward, the humiliation was just beginning. His face flushed with heat, as if he'd been slapped. His ears burned. He looked down at the envelope in his hands. It was wrinkled now, the corners bent inward from where he'd clenched it. It had once been neat, organized, a quiet symbol of preparation, of dignity. Now, it felt childish, pointless. His voice, which he had carefully measured a minute ago, now seemed far away, like it belonged to someone else. In that instant, he was no longer the man who had spent decades supervising construction sites, managing crises, commanding respect. He was a ghost of that man, standing in a fluorescent-lit bank lobby, being dismissed like someone who couldn't read their own bills. It felt like standing in front of a classroom again, being scolded for something he didn't understand, while everyone stared and no one helped. Except this time, he wasn't a child. He was 73, and somehow, that made it hurt more. Just as Edward stepped slightly back from the counter, his cheeks still burning, a voice rang out, sharp, authoritative, almost theatrical in its delivery. "Is there a problem here?" The sound cut through the room like a judge's gavel. Conversation slowed. Even the printer in the corner seemed to quiet. Heads turned, and then He appeared. Brian Douglas, the branch manager, emerging from a side office, like an actor taking center stage. He walked with tight, deliberate strides, dress shoes echoing with each step against the polished tile. His suit fit like armor, dark navy, crisp collar, not a wrinkle in sight. His hair was slicked back, his jaw clenched. He didn't just walk, he arrived, exuding the kind of presence that demanded submission, not trust. His eyes moved fast, first to Lindsay, then to Edward, and just like that, the look happened. A single sweep of the eyes, the top to bottom scan. The kind of glance that didn't just assess, but categorized. Edward saw it. He felt it. In his bones. He wasn't a customer. He was a problem. A time waster. A statistic. Someone out of touch. Dragging his worn shoes through a place no longer meant for people like him. Brian didn't even nod at Edward. His attention snapped straight to Lindsay. "What's going on?" he asked, his tone already laced with irritation, as though he were entering a room mid-emergency and was clearly the most competent person in it. Lindsay, eager to shift the spotlight off herself, answered quickly. "He's just having trouble understanding the new fees," she said, went with a shrug. The he landed like a kick. Edward wasn't even Mr. Mitchell anymore. He was just a pronoun, a mild inconvenience. Edward cleared his throat and stepped forward, refusing to let the narrative run without him. "With respect," he began, his voice calm but charged with quiet frustration. "I'm not having trouble understanding. I'm trying to clarify why these charges suddenly started showing up after all these years. I've had this account for over 15 years, and I've never seen this fee before." Brian turned to him fully now, arms crossed, chin lifted slightly, as if the mere act of responding was an effort. "It's in the policy," he said bluntly. "We updated the fee structure last year. Notifications were sent to all customers, via email and digital banking." Edward nodded slowly, trying to stay composed. "I don't use email. I've never signed up for online banking. I handle everything in person. That's how I've always managed my account." Brian raised one brow, barely masking his annoyance. "That may be how you've chosen to do things," he replied, "but that's not how the world works anymore." There it was, the line, the wall. Edward's lips parted, but no sound came out. Not yet. Brian went on, not giving him room to reply. "We serve tens of thousands of customers," he continued, voice firm, calculated. "We can't tailor our system to individual preferences. It's your responsibility to stay informed. If you're unable to maintain the required balance to avoid fees, maybe this bank isn't the right fit for your needs." The sentence hit with brutal efficiency. There was no apology, no empathy, just a polite way of saying, "Take your business elsewhere if you can't keep up." The words weren't loud, but they echoed like a gavel in Edward's ears. He felt the pressure behind his eyes building, the kind that comes not from anger, but from being completely, utterly dismissed. No discussion, no investigation, just policy. Edward didn't respond, not because he didn't have words, but because none of them felt like they would matter. The silence that followed Brian's remark wasn't empty. It was full of something colder. Finality. The kind of silence that settles after a door has been shut in your face. Not slammed, but gently, politely, decisively. Brian had already turned away, signaling with his body language that the conversation was over. Lindsay had gone back to her screen, eyes glazed, fingers tapping. The line behind Edward inched forward, people in it no longer paying attention or pretending not to. But Edward could still feel it, that weightless, invisible rejection that didn't make a sound but screamed in his chest. He didn't yell. He didn't protest. Instead, he simply lowered his gaze, slowly reaching for the paper that had been pushed back toward him like trash no one wanted to deal with. His hand trembled slightly as he gathered the papers, trying not to let them scatter. No one helped. No one even looked. As he clutched the crumpled envelope to his chest, a quiet thought formed in the back of his mind. simple, heavy, and cruel in its honesty. I just came here to ask a question, but they've made me feel like I'm the problem. The realization cut deeper than any policy or fee ever could. It wasn't the charge that hurt most. It was the message beneath it. You don't belong here anymore. The air in the bank felt colder now, tighter, as if the room itself had pushed him out. He turned slightly, not sure whether to leave or try one last time, but his body already knew the answer. His dignity was in retreat, step by step, paper by paper. No one stopped him. No one said a word. And in that moment, surrounded by marble floors, glowing screen, and laminated smiles, Edward Mitchell became invisible. Edward was frozen in place, still clutching the wrinkled envelope to his chest, his dignity unraveling by the second. He didn't know what to do. Step forward, speak up again, or simply walk out and swallow the humiliation. The buzzing in his ears drowned out the ambient noise of the bank. Even the voices of Brian and Lindsay seemed far away now, as if they were speaking underwater. He felt like a man slowly disappearing in plain sight. And then a voice, clear, calm, not loud, but impossible to ignore. "Excuse me," it said, the syllables sharp as glass. "He's not asking for special treatment. He's asking for his legal rights." The effect was immediate. The atmosphere in the bank shifted, as if someone had pulled the oxygen from the room. Heads turned. Fast. The customer service agent at counter 4 stopped mid-sentence. A man standing near the coin deposit machine straightened up and squinted toward the sound. Brian Douglas's stride halted in mid-step. Even Lindsay's fingers froze above her keyboard, suspended in mid-air. It wasn't just what the voice said. It was how it was said, with a tone that didn't plead, didn't suggest, but commanded. All eyes locked on the woman standing halfway across the floor. She wasn't grandstanding. She wasn't flustered. She simply stood, shoulders square, eyes steady, one hand resting on the strap of a structured leather bag. Jasmine Crockett. Her name didn't need announcing. It carried itself in the air. Her slate gray blazer looked sharper than any suit in the building. Her curls were pinned back with effortless confidence, but it was the look in her eyes, fierce, focused, and completely unmoved by protocol, that told everyone. They were no longer in control of this narrative. Jasmine didn't break eye contact. Her gaze was locked onto Brian, like a scalpel finding its target. She'd seen everything. The dismissive tone, the shrug from Lindsay, the cold shutdown. She didn't need to hear the entire conversation. She understood the playbook. She'd seen it in courtroom after courtroom, boardroom after boardroom, people in power reducing the elderly to afterthoughts, wrapping injustice in polite language and policy manuals. "No one here is asking for favors," she continued, stepping forward now, slow and deliberate. "What you just witnessed was an elder being stonewalled over unexplained deductions from his account and told, essentially, to leave if he couldn't keep up." A hush had settled over the entire room, like the moment before a storm touches ground. Edward turned toward the voice, blinking, as if he were emerging from fog. He didn't know who she was, not exactly, but everything about her, her poise, her words, the heat in her voice, struck something inside him that had been buried. Hope. For the first time that day, someone had stepped between him and the system, not to explain it, but to challenge it. And for the first time, Brian didn't have an immediate answer. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. The script he was used to reading from no longer applied. Jasmine Crockett was here now, and the rules had just changed. From the moment Jasmine Crockett stepped forward, the atmosphere in the bank shifted from passive discomfort to electric tension. She didn't storm. She didn't shout. She dissected, like a skilled surgeon entering a trauma scene. She moved with the calm of someone who had done this before, hundreds of times. Her heels clicked softly against the polished tile as she approached Edward, who stood still, stunned by her presence and unsure whether to speak. She offered him a gentle nod, not pity, but respect, before extending her hand toward the crumpled envelope in his grip. "May I?" she asked, her voice low, but commanding. Edward, still processing everything, gave a faint nod and handed her the envelope, as if passing a sacred object. She took it with both hands, smoothing the edges as she opened it with clinical precision, unfolding each document, her eyes scanning quickly, sharply, completely locked in. She didn't speak immediately. Her eyes darted from line to line, account statements, dates, transaction codes. A silence fell over the room again, this one thicker, heavier, because everyone knew what came next would change everything. Edward's breath caught as he watched her work, part of him terrified that even she wouldn't find anything wrong, that maybe the system really was just how things worked. But that fear didn't last long. Jasmine's eyes narrowed, her lips tightening into a razor-thin line. And then she looked up, not at Edward, but directly at Brian. "These charges," she said slowly, holding up a printed page between her fingers like a courtroom exhibit, "started appearing the month after his pension deposits became irregular. That timing isn't random. That timing is calculated." Brian shifted. "Ma'am," he began, carefully selecting his words, "we apply fees in accordance with head office policy. Everything is automated and—" Jasmine raised one hand, stopping him mid-sentence with the effortless authority of a judge sustaining her own objection. "I know what your policies say," she said firmly. "I've read them, probably more times than you have. I'm a financial regulatory attorney. I work in federal oversight. I've litigated against institutions twice your size, for less than what's happening here." A murmur rippled through the lobby. Lindsay stiffened behind the counter, her eyes now darting between Jasmine and Brian. One of the tellers leaned in slightly, trying to catch every word. Jasmine's voice didn't rise, but the intensity behind it was unmistakable. She stepped forward, closing the distance between her and Brian without hesitation. Her movements were precise, her words sharpened to the point of a blade. "You're not just overcharging a customer," she continued, tapping the paper with the back of her nail. "You're penalizing him because he's no longer receiving steady income. You're applying maintenance fees, conveniently, only when his deposits drop below threshold, and without any formal notification, verbal or written, accessible to someone who's never opted into digital banking. That is not policy, that is predation." Brian tried to stand his ground, adjusting the cuff of his sleeve like it might give him more authority. "Look, I don't write the rule," he said. "We're just following the structure our systems are set to." "No," Jasmine cut in, voice like steel. "You're hiding behind automation as a shield from misconduct. You think if you embed exploitation deep enough in the system, no one will notice. But I'm standing here. I noticed. And now, everyone else has too." She turned slightly, raising her voice, not to yell, but to project, making sure every customer in the bank could hear her. "How many of you have seen unexplained charges on your accounts? How many of you have spoken up, only to be told you didn't understand the fine print?" A few hands hesitantly rose. An elderly man near the deposit slip station nodded. A middle-aged woman clutched her purse tighter, eyes wide with realization. "This," Jasmine said, sweeping the paper slightly in the air, "is systemic targeting of vulnerable customers, specifically the elderly. And if I run a forensic audit on the transaction patterns across your branch's account holders, especially those over 65, I guarantee this isn't an isolated incident." Brian's confidence visibly cracked. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. At first, then, "If there's an error, we can correct it. There's no need to—" "Oh, it's not just an error anymore," Jasmine replied, cutting in smoothly. "It's a pattern, and patterns have consequences." She turned back to Edward, her entire tone shifting in an instant. The fire in her voice softened to warmth. "Mr. Mitchell, thank you for standing up and questioning something that didn't sit right. Most people wouldn't. Most people would have walked out in silence. Edward blinked, overwhelmed, not just by her words, but by the fierce clarity with which she saw him. Not as a nuisance, not as an outdated relic, but as a man who had been wronged. I didn't know what to do, he said quietly. I just wanted someone to look. Well, she said, turning back to Brian one last time, her voice now low but laced with finality. Now everyone's looking. The room was completely still. The only sound was the low hum of fluorescent lights and the soft rustle of someone shifting nervously in line. Brian looked pale now. His posture, once stiff and commanding, had loosened. He knew this wasn't something he could sweep under the rug. Not anymore. Not with her here. Jasmine handed the documents back to Edward, placing them carefully into his hands, like returning evidence to its rightful owner. We're not done, she said, to no one and everyone. But we've started. And just like that, the balance of power in the room had shifted, not through shouting, not through chaos, but through truth, spoken clearly, by someone who refused to let injustice hide behind a smile and a suit. Jasmine's final words still echoed in the room. Now everyone's looking. And they were. For a few long, charged seconds, no one moved. The lobby stood frozen, as if time itself had paused to absorb what had just happened. Jasmine's presence alone had shaken the ground beneath the bank's polished floors, but what happened next would fracture the very walls of silence that had held for too long. From the second row of chairs, an elderly woman slowly raised her hand. It was a small gesture, gentle, almost shy, but it pierced the tension like a whistle in a minefield. She wore a soft lavender cardigan, her silver gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, and her eyes, though tired, were steady. She didn't stand. She didn't shout. She simply lifted her hand and said, I've lost nearly $200 over the last few months. I didn't know why. No one explained anything. There was a moment of stillness, then movement. People began turning toward her. Some were surprised. Some weren't. Jasmine turned too, nodding, encouraging the woman with a soft look that said, You're safe to speak now. Before Brian could react, another voice chimed in, from the back near the deposit slips. An older man, East Asian, wearing a faded bomber jacket and a Yankees cap. His voice cracked slightly as he spoke. I thought it was just me, he said quietly. I thought maybe I didn't read the terms right. I never finished high school. I blame myself. His words landed like stones in a glass building. There was no anger in his tone, only resignation. And beneath that, shame. The kind of shame engineered by institutions that rely on confusion to keep the vulnerable quiet. The kind that turns personal responsibility into weaponized guilt. Jasmine turned to face Brian again, her expression now transformed. No longer merely firm, it was burning with a kind of righteous fury that doesn't raise its voice, but amplifies through precision. Sir, she said, each word deliberate. When one person raises a concern, maybe it's a misunderstanding. When two speak up, maybe it's a coincidence. But when half a dozen elderly customers start realizing they've all been charged in ways they can't explain, ways you can't explain, she stepped forward, her heels echoing through the silence. That is no longer a technical issue. That's not confusion. That's a scheme. Brian tried to hold her gaze, but the flicker in his eyes betrayed him. He swallowed hard. For the first time since entering the conversation, he looked like a man without a script. His confident posture sagged ever so slightly, and his eyes darted toward Lindsay. But Lindsay was no longer backing him. She stared at the floor, lips pressed shut, as if she knew the tide had turned. Jasmine didn't stop. She gestured broadly now, addressing the room, not just the staff, not just the manager, but every soul within earshot. This isn't a mistake. This is a mechanism, a system built on silence and complexity. You prey on confusion. You use policies like traps and digital communication as camouflage. You charge fees when people are most vulnerable, when their income drops, when they stop receiving direct deposits, when they're no longer logging into email, and you do it because you bet they won't fight back. Another murmur rolled through the room. It wasn't noise, it was awakening. A wave of realization, spreading face to face, eye to eye. Jasmine turned back to the elderly woman in the lavender cardigan. "Ma'am," she asked gently, "did anyone ever send you a letter or call you about those charges?" The woman shook her head. "No," she said. "Just statements. I don't check them online. My daughter handles email. I only came in today because I needed to order a new card." Jasmine nodded, then turned to the man in the Yankees cap. "And you?" He hesitated, then said, "I got one email. It was full of legal terms I didn't understand, so I ignored it." Jasmine turned back to Brian and said flatly, "You're relying on digital exclusion. You're taking advantage of people who aren't digitally fluent, and you're designing your entire communication strategy around non-responsiveness. That's not oversight. That's a business model." The words hit like thunder. Brian opened his mouth, some reflex buried deep inside trying to do damage control. But Jasmine cut him off before he could utter a single word. "I've seen this before. Banks layering predatory structures under the guise of modernization. You shift the rules, bury the notifications, automate the deductions, and wash your hands of it all by blaming the system." She stepped closer now, her tone lowering. Not out of weakness, but to make every syllable hit harder. "But you forget the human cost. You forget these people have names, histories, families. You forget they built the world you're trying to charge them to stay in." Edward stood still beside her, speechless. Not out of fear this time, but awe. The woman beside him had just named the pain he hadn't been able to describe. The loneliness, the guilt, the doubt. All of it, reframed in truth, in justice. For the first time in years, he felt seen. Across the lobby, more customers began murmuring. A woman in her 60s pulled out her phone and started snapping pictures of the posted fee policies. A man whispered to his wife, then stepped out of line and moved toward Edward. "Sir," he said quietly, "I think the same thing's happening to my dad's account. Can we talk?" Jasmine heard him and nodded. "You're not alone," she said. "None of you are." Brian raised both hands slightly on trying to regain control. Listen, we're willing to review these accounts. I'll escalate this to the regional office. There's no need to." "To what?" Jasmine interrupted. "To keep things quiet? To protect your job? You had your chance to do the right thing when Mr. Mitchell asked for help, but you dismissed him. You humiliated him. And now that the lights are on, you want to pull the curtains back down?" No one moved, not even the staff behind the counters. One of them had quietly stepped away and was now speaking to someone on the phone in a low voice. Maybe corporate, maybe legal. Jasmine let the silence stretch a moment longer. Then she pulled a slim notepad from her bag and scribbled a number on it. She handed it to Edward. "This is my office line. We'll be starting a formal complaint and class action. I want you to be the first name on the list." Edward took the paper with trembling hands. He tried to speak, but no words came out, only a deep breath, thick with gratitude. Jasmine turned to the crowd and spoke one final time. "You deserve clarity. You deserve respect. And if no one gives it to you, you have every right to demand it." And in that moment, the bank wasn't just a financial institution. It was a courtroom, a battleground, a stage. And Jasmine Crockett had just given voice to every person who'd ever felt small, at the mercy of a machine pretending to be neutral. And the silence that followed was no longer one of shame. It was power, waiting to rise. The room was no longer a bank lobby. It was a courtroom, with no judge, no jury, just truth standing on one side and excuses collapsing on the other. Jasmine stood tall, hands folded at her waist, a calm storm in a sharp blazer. Customers surrounded her now, not physically, but in presence. Their silence wasn't passive anymore. It was electric, heavy with realization. Cell phones were out, quietly recording, camera lights blinking in corners. One employee at the far end of the counter had her phone pointed discreetly at Brian. Another, previously stone-faced, was now visibly uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot. The illusion of control had shattered, and Brian Douglas knew it. He tried to hold the line, keep his voice even, but his throat betrayed him. It caught on the first word. We haven't reviewed every account yet, he stammered, avoiding Jasmine's gaze, eyes darting to the ceiling, then the marble floor, then nowhere in particular. There's a possibility that several hundred accounts could have been affected. He said it too fast, as if hoping speed would dull the impact, but it didn't. The words hit like a dropped microphone. A few people gasped. Someone dropped a pen. Lindsay's face went ghostly white behind the glass. Jasmine didn't blink. She leaned in slightly, her voice steady, unwavering, each syllable designed to land like a verdict. You just admitted to a systemic financial abuse of senior citizens, hundreds of accounts, unauthorized or unexplained deductions, no real consent, no notice. Brian opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Jasmine tilted her head slightly, and her tone shifted from direct to surgical. Thank you, she said. You've just made my case. Then she reached into her bag, pulled out her phone, and raised it slowly, already recording. She didn't need to yell. She didn't need to point. She simply lifted the phone and let her words do the cutting. For the record, she said calmly into the camera, this is a branch manager at a national bank confirming that his location may have deducted fees from potentially hundreds of elderly clients' accounts, without proper review or transparency. We'll be forwarding this to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the State Attorney General, and any class action legal teams currently building cases against exploitative banking practices. Brian took a step back, his jaw clenched, sweat formed on his forehead. Barely visible, but undeniably there. He was unraveling, and everyone could see it. The polished image, the corporate posture, the thin layer of authority, it was all falling away like stage makeup under a hot spotlight. Please, he said quickly, voice finally breaking. We can fix this. I can fix it. There's no need to escalate. Fixing this, Jasmine cut in sharply, lowering her phone, but not her tone, does not mean quietly refunding a few accounts and hoping we forget. Fixing this means accountability. It means transparency. It means investigating every affected customer, especially those who didn't even realize they were being drained month by month. She took one step closer. Her voice dropped, but every word now echoed like a gavel. You gambled on silence, she said. You banked on confusion. And you thought no one would question it because your victims were too old, too tired, or too disconnected to notice. Brian's hands were trembling now, subtle but visible. He glanced around the room, realizing he had no allies left. Not even Lindsay, not the tellers, not the customers. All of them were watching, recording, remembering. Jasmine pointed to Edward without turning. This man came in for help. You gave him humiliation. She gestured to the older woman in lavender. She lost money for months. You gave her indifference. She looked back at Brian. And now that you're caught, all you have to offer is panic. Brian tried again. If you give us some time, if we could just... There is no time left, Jasmine said coldly. The time was when Edward first walked in. The time was when she first noticed missing funds. The time was when your employee dismissed a senior citizen with condescension, instead of compassion. Another murmur rippled through the room, louder now. People weren't just observers anymore. They were witnesses. This wasn't just a confrontation. This was exposure. And Jasmine Crockett had peeled the mask off a machine that had long operated in the shadows. She turned back to Edward, her voice gentler. "We're going to make sure this isn't brushed aside, Mr. Mitchell. You've done something bigger than you realize." Edward stood speechless, his hand still clutching the envelope that started it all. His heart was pounding, not from fear anymore, but from something new, vindication. He nodded slowly, unsure if he could speak without choking on emotion. Jasmine slipped her phone into her bag, then faced the rest of the lobby. "If you believe you've been affected," she said, addressing everyone now, "stay. Speak. Share your stories. This is no longer about one account. This is about every person who's ever been told they're too old to understand what's being taken from them." The tension that had once pressed down on the room had reversed. It was rising now, boiling into momentum. The bank manager's silence had become damning. The lobby had become a megaphone. The customers, once quiet, were now voices waiting to be heard. And Jasmine, she wasn't leaving with a complaint. She was leaving with a movement. Brian's silence said everything. But Jasmine wasn't done. She had cracked the dam. Now it was time to let it flood. Without breaking stride, she reached back into her bag and pulled out her phone. Her fingers moved quickly, faster than any of the bank staff could react. She wasn't calling for backup. She was activating a network. With the calm efficiency of someone who had done this before, Jasmine opened a secure app, tapped into her contact list, and began sending voice memos, short texts, live alerts, legal clinics, consumer watchdogs, independent media outlets. By the time she looked up again, the story had already left the building. She turned to the crowd. "Journalists are on their way," she announced clearly, "and so are attorneys. If you've been affected, or even if you think you might have been, start gathering your paperwork. Start documenting everything." Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried the force of a public siren. The bank lobby, once tense with embarrassment and silent suffering, had become a war room. The reaction was immediate. Customers began digging into purses, wallets, tote bags. Printed statements unfolded. Folders snapped open. Receipts spilled onto countertops. Phone cameras lit up. Some began filming Jasmine. Others pointed lenses at Brian, still frozen near the counter, blinking rapidly as if trying to wake from a nightmare. One elderly woman in a floral blouse began flipping through a spiral-bound notebook, comparing handwritten balance notes with the bank's transaction logs. Another customer was already live streaming the chaos to over 800 viewers on a neighborhood social media page. Truth was viral now, and nothing could contain it. The bank staff panicked quietly. Lindsay whispered something to a coworker, then stepped away from her terminal and disappeared through a door marked "Staff Only." The branch supervisor, a man no one had seen until now, suddenly emerged from the glass office in the back, phone to his ear, beads of sweat forming at his temple. His voice was urgent, low, fast. He was calling someone, high up. But the power had already slipped from corporate hands. Jasmine hadn't just sparked outrage. She had created witnesses. Within minutes, the bank's entire internal structure began to buckle under scrutiny. A digital news crew arrived faster than anyone expected. 2 reporters with press badges, one carrying a mic, the other already rolling. They bypassed the reception desk and made a straight line toward Jasmine, who greeted them not as a victim, but as a general briefing the media at the front line of injustice. Behind her, Edward stood holding his now famous envelope, like a flag that had somehow survived the battle. "We have confirmation," Jasmine told the reporters, "from the branch manager himself. Hundreds of elderly accounts may have been systematically targeted with unexplained maintenance fees, fees that appear to begin precisely when pension deposits stop or drop. There was no formal consent, no clear warning. This is financial abuse disguised as policy." Cameras flashed. A journalist asked if federal regulators had been notified. "They have now," Jasmine replied. "I've already sent the preliminary clip to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and the State Attorney General's office. Legal teams are reviewing this moment by moment." The branch supervisor stepped forward, his face pale. Ms. Crockett, he said, almost breathless, we've just received instructions from Central Compliance. Mr. Douglas has been placed on immediate administrative leave pending internal investigation. A full audit will begin today. His words were carefully measured, but hollow. His voice cracked at the edges. The room didn't erupt. It didn't need to. The victory didn't roar. It rippled. Brian stood motionless, his carefully sculpted image now crumbling in real time. He didn't speak. He didn't argue. He simply turned, walked toward the hallway, and vanished into the back of the bank. A ghost of authority erased by accountability. But Jasmine wasn't done. She turned to the remaining staff. The rest of you, start assisting these people. Print their statements, pull their histories, provide them with written summaries of every fee you've ever charged. Do not deflect. Do not delay. I will remain here to ensure compliance, and our legal volunteers will be joining shortly to document every account reviewed. And they obeyed. Tellers who had once looked bored now looked sharp and serious. Printers whirred to life. The lobby filled with movement. But it wasn't chaos. It was clarity. Every step had purpose. Every customer became an investigator. People compared notes, shared screenshots. An elderly couple, who had never spoken to each other in the waiting chairs, were now side by side checking dates and transaction codes. The bank had never felt more alive, and yet it had never looked more exposed. As the hours ticked on, the entire operation transformed from passive institution to site of a financial uprising. News vans parked outside. Attorneys set up temporary check-in points by the coffee station. Clipboards passed from hand to hand. Jasmine stood at the center of it all, not giving interviews for attention, but providing coordination, direction, and legal insight. She was organizing a crowd that had, only an hour ago, been fractured by shame and confusion. Now, they were aligned, awake, and angry. By late afternoon, the bank released its first official public statement. It arrived in the form of a corporate tweet and a printed letter posted at the front entrance. We are aware of the concerns raised at our downtown branch and take them seriously. An emergency internal audit is underway to review all maintenance fee activity. Any accounts affected will be contacted and refunded where appropriate. We thank our community for holding us accountable. But it was too late for half measures. The story had already gone national. Jasmine had uploaded the footage, full and unedited, to public channels. Edward's story was already being shared across thousands of timelines. Respect for seniors began trending by the time the sun dipped low over the glass windows. Every repost carried the same truth. One man stood up, and one woman refused to let him fall alone. And in that bank, where policy once silenced people, a movement had taken root. Not in speeches but in actions. Not in anger, but in unbreakable resolve. The system had counted on confusion. It had bet on silence. But Jasmine Crockett bet on truth. And truth, it turned out, was louder than everything. The sun had long set by the time the chaos settled, but justice, as always, was fashionably late and painfully earned. The bank, under pressure from regulators, lawyers, and a media storm that refused to die, was forced to act quickly and decisively. An emergency audit uncovered not dozens, but hundreds of affected accounts, all tied together by a clear pattern: low monthly balances, irregular deposit histories, and a common demographic thread: age. For far too long, customers like Edward had been quietly drained, dollar by dollar, cent by cent, under the camouflage of standard policy. Now, under a spotlight they couldn't dim, the institution did what all exposed giants do. It paid to protect itself. Edward was invited back, not through a cold-form letter or a robotic voicemail, but with a formal, hand-delivered apology. The regional director himself stood beside a compliance officer as they slid a certified check across the table. The amount reflected every penny lost to unjustified fees, and then some. It included a goodwill adjustment, though everyone in the room knew what it really was: a public settlement to buy silence that would never come. Edward didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply looked down at the check, then back at the men, and said quietly, "I never wanted compensation. I wanted someone to listen." His voice didn't shake, but theirs did. They thanked him, but their gratitude felt hollow next to the weight of what he'd endured. Across the city, and soon the country, stories multiplied. Customers from other branches came forward. Seniors in retirement homes asked their children to check their accounts. Veterans, widows, teachers, factory workers. Voices that had been told they were too old to matter were suddenly the center of the conversation. Bank executives issued press releases full of legal jargon, promises of transparency, new customer protections. It wasn't guilt, it was containment, but the damage was already done. Jasmine Crockett had ensured that the receipts didn't disappear into filing cabinets. She took them to courtrooms, to newsrooms, to the floor of the state assembly. And she didn't go alone. A week after the incident, Edward stood beside her again. This time not in a bank lobby, but on the set of a national news broadcast. Cameras rolled. The host leaned in. Lights burned white hot. Jasmine sat poised, a calm force of reckoning in a storm of spin. The anchor asked her what this all meant, why this moment had resonated with millions across the country. Jasmine didn't miss a beat. "When the elderly are treated like burdens," she said, her voice slow, each word a hammer striking steel, "society doesn't just lose its compassion. It loses its memory. It loses its values. It loses its sense of justice." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle across the room. "These aren't just clients. These are our teachers, our builders, our protectors, our parents. When you rob them of dignity, you rob the rest of us of the very foundation we stand on." The host didn't speak. No one dared to interrupt. Beside her, Edward sat with his hands folded in his lap, the same envelope in his coat pocket, not because he needed it now, but because it had become a symbol, a reminder of how something so small, so ordinary that it could become a weapon in the hands of the right voice. When the interview wrapped, the cameras faded to black, but the moment didn't end. Jasmine turned to Edward, reached out her hand, and this time, he didn't hesitate. He rose, took her hand firmly, and looked her in the eye. "I never thought anyone would stand up for me," he said. "For people like me. I thought we were just supposed to accept it. Be quiet, move on." His voice was stronger now, not because the pain was gone, but because he had found something stronger than pain, vindication. He tightened his grip slightly and said, with a steady nod, "But today, I know better. I know that when you're right, you speak up." Jasmine smiled, not the rehearsed kind politicians give, but the rare kind that says, "You did it." Outside the studio, the air was cool. A small crowd had gathered, holding signs with Edward's name, wearing pins that read, "Number Justice for Seniors." There were college students, retired nurses, bus drivers, veterans, a teenager on crutches who helped his grandmother navigate a new checking app. They weren't protesting. They were witnessing. One by one, they approached Edward, not like a victim, but like a survivor who spoke for all of them. Later that month, the bank's CEO would testify before Congress. Federal hearings would be scheduled, settlements would be paid, policies would change. But Edward Mitchell didn't need legislation to validate his worth. He already had his answer, delivered not through politics or profit, but through the quiet strength of one sentence he repeated to anyone who asked what had happened. "I asked for help, and someone answered." And somewhere in a folder on Jasmine Crockett's desk, beneath press clippings and legal drafts, was a wrinkled envelope with faded creases and pen marks and shaky handwriting. Proof that a man once treated like a footnote had become the title of a story far bigger than he ever imagined. The interview had barely wrapped when the footage hit the internet. Clipped from a phone-recorded live stream inside the bank, it captured everything. The humiliation, the confrontation, the confession, and Jasmine's explosive declaration to the press. Within hours, it was everywhere. By midnight, the clip had gone viral, racing across timelines and group chats, exploding on platforms like wildfire. The title alone was enough to stop thumbs mid-scroll. Elderly man humiliated at bank until Jasmine Crockett steps in. But it wasn't the title that spread like fuel. It was the truth it revealed. The video opened with a shaky shot of Edward standing at the counter, his back slightly hunched, his voice trembling as he tried to explain. Viewers could hear Lindsay's cold reply, see Brian's smug dismissal, and then, like thunder breaking, Jasmine's voice slicing through it all. He's not asking for favors. He's asking for his legal rights. The clip captured every second of her dismantling the system in real time. And finally, Brian's damning confession. Maybe a few hundred accounts. We haven't checked yet. It was over 3 minutes long, far past the modern attention span, and no one could look away. By the next morning, #JusticeForSeniors was trending in 4 countries. News anchors repeated Jasmine's quotes over stock footage of banks. Influencers shared the clip with captions like, "This is what real advocacy looks like." But the most powerful reaction didn't come from likes or comments. It came from screens in living rooms across the country, where older viewers watched, wide-eyed, sometimes in silence, sometimes in tears. In retirement communities in Florida, watch parties were held in common rooms. Residents huddled around smart TVs and whispered names of banks that had charged them unexplained fees. In rural towns in Nebraska, seniors called their children and asked, "Can you check my statement?" In inner-city neighborhoods in Detroit and Houston, families gathered at kitchen tables, flipping through piles of bank paperwork for the first time in years. In church basements, senior centers, veterans' halls, something ancient and urgent had been awakened, a collective question that could no longer be ignored. Have they been stealing from me too? By the end of the day, phone lines at financial law firms were flooded. Pro bono legal hotlines for the elderly reported a 900% spike in calls. Jasmine Crockett's office, once accustomed to 2 or 3 walk-ins a week, now had dozens showing up in person, holding folders, binders, envelopes, some even handwritten notebooks filled with years of suspicious deductions and banking terms they never fully understood. Most didn't come with anger. They came with hope. Hope that someone would finally look. The media dubbed it the Mitchell effect, named after the man whose quiet question had set everything in motion. Journalists traced similar complaints across other banks. Congressional aides requested copies of the video for inclusion in financial ethics hearings. Think pieces flooded the internet with titles like "Digitally Excluded: How Modern Banking Marginalizes the Elderly," and "Policy or Predation: When Convenience Becomes a Cover." And at the center of it all was Edward Mitchell, the man who once stood in silence, now the face of a movement. He wasn't on every screen, he wasn't doing interviews, but his name was in every inbox. His story was in every boardroom. His voice, captured in that moment when he looked Jasmine in the eye and said, "Today I know better. When you're right, you speak up." That sentence became a battle cry for thousands who had been gaslit into silence. Banks across the country scrambled. Internal reviews launched. Policy memos were revised. Language was softened. But it wasn't enough. People were watching now. Jasmine Crockett had not just pulled the curtain back, she had torn it down. Lawmakers began drafting legislation for mandatory plain language disclosures and analog outreach to senior clients. Advocacy groups formed alliances. Clergy members preached on financial justice. Libraries held free financial literacy workshops. Young people sat down with their grandparents, tablets in hand, finally decoding decades of confusion in a single sitting. And through it all, one clip kept playing, over and over again. Not because it was shocking, not because it was viral, but because it was real. A man who had been treated like dead weight proved to the world that he was worth listening to. A woman who refused to look away showed what it meant to lead. And a country, long blind to slow, silent theft, finally opened its eyes. But Jasmine knew viral fame wasn't enough. Justice couldn't survive off trending hashtags and fleeting outrage. It needed roots. It needed a name. So 3 days after Edward's story exploded across the internet, Jasmine stood behind a podium in a crowded press conference, cameras flashing from every angle, and announced what would become a nationwide campaign. One that wasn't just about banking, or one man, or one institution. It was about respect. Too often, she began, her voice steady and amplified by rows of microphones, we measure a person's worth by how current they are, how connected, how tech-savvy, how quick to keep up with a system that's designed to outpace them. And in doing so, we've turned convenience into a weapon. We've turned age into a liability. She paused, letting the silence expand across the room. But not anymore. Today we're launching something bigger than a lawsuit, bigger than one bank. We are launching a campaign called Respect Beyond Age, because dignity doesn't expire when you stop earning a paycheck. Rights don't vanish when you turn 65. And no one deserves to be punished for growing old. The words struck like lightning. Reporters scribbled furiously. Newsrooms cut live to her speech. Social feeds lit up instantly. Respect Beyond Age began trending before Jasmine even stepped away from the podium. Within hours, the campaign's mission statement and toolkit were online. Free, public, simple. Flyers translated into 10 languages. Printable guides sent to churches, community centers, barbershops, senior homes. Volunteers, many of them college students, began making door-to-door visits, offering help reviewing bank statements and utility bills. The campaign wasn't about charity, it was about defense. Jasmine had reframed the conversation. Aging wasn't a weakness, it was a battle you deserve backup in. Edward Mitchell's image was featured prominently, not as a victim, but as the catalyst. A grainy still from the viral video became the campaign's signature poster. Edward standing tall, holding his folder of documents. Jasmine beside him like a shield. The tagline underneath was simple but thunderous. He stood up. Now we stand with him. And people did stand. Marches were organized in over 50 cities. Not angry riots, but peaceful walkouts. Thousands of elderly citizens and their allies, dressed in gray and white, holding signs that read, "My wisdom deserves protection, and respect is not a subscription service." Some walked with canes. Some were pushed in wheelchairs. Some came with 3 generations at their side. Together, they moved through downtowns and financial districts, no longer invisible. The generation once ignored had become impossible to unsee. Behind the scenes, Jasmine was tireless. She partnered with tech companies to simplify access for older clients. She held closed-door meetings with CEOs of major banks, reading real stories aloud until they could no longer look away. She launched hotlines, wrote op-eds, created toolkits for identifying silent financial abuse. When she spoke in Congress, she carried Edward's original envelope with her, a reminder of how much weight could be hidden in something so small. But the heart of the movement wasn't in the boardrooms. It was in living rooms, in phone calls, in hospital visits, in grocery lines, where strangers started helping seniors check the payment machines, in grandchildren sitting with their grandparents and saying, "Let's look at this together." For years, a generation had been quietly drained by fees, by forms, by systems built to exclude. And for the first time, they had a banner to gather under, a voice that wasn't speaking over them, but with them. Jasmine stood at the front of every initiative, every panel, every hearing, but she never let people forget where it started. "We launched this because of one man," she said in an interview 6 weeks later. "A man who came in quietly, politely, hoping someone would just explain a charge. They treated him like a burden. They tried to push him out. But Edward Mitchell didn't leave. He stood. And now so will we." And so they did. From senior veterans to retired teachers, from rural farmers to urban grandmothers. A movement that began in a bank branch had transformed into a revolution of dignity. And it carried one truth in every voice, every flyer, every step. Respect isn't earned through speed, it's owed through humanity, and it extends beyond age. And even as the banners were folded, the marches concluded, and the news cycles moved on, one truth still echoed louder than any headline. This was never just about money. It was about memory, about who we choose to protect, and who we too often leave behind. In every city, in every home, the question now hung in the air. Who's watching over those who once watched over us? That's when Jasmine stepped back, not from the fight, but from the center. She had never meant to be the hero of this story. She was just the one who refused to walk away when injustice walked in wearing a tie and a smile. Now, it was our turn. As Edward's name became a symbol, as more families dug into old records and discovered truths they were never told, Jasmine issued one final call, not to outrage, but to action. If you have parents, if you have grandparents, she said in a video now played in classrooms, offices, and living rooms across the nation, protect them. Ask the questions they've been told not to ask. Sit beside them as they scroll through confusion. Stand in front of them when systems push them back. Be the voice they were once for you. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The quiet was already heavy. Because silence, she added, her eyes locked on the camera, has never protected justice. Silence is what injustice feeds on. And if we don't speak, if we don't look, we become part of the theft. The screen faded to black, but her words didn't. They stayed. In every heart that had once overlooked the quiet struggles of an older loved one. In every home where someone opened a drawer of dusty statements and asked finally, "What happened here?" In every soul that had been waiting too long for someone to say it out loud. Don't let silence kill justice. Be louder. Be better. Be like Jasmine. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.